He had gone blind in his old age, a cruel irony for a man whose life was defined by the visual perfection of his craft. This infirmity left the business to his son, Thomas. Thomas was a boy of 24 years, though he possessed the ethereal, unnerving stillness of something much older, or perhaps something that had never truly been young. He was pale, his skin the color of unbaked dough, and his eyes were wide, dark orbs that never seemed to blink long enough to offer the observer a moment of reprieve. He moved through the workshop with a spectral grace, his footsteps muffled by the thick drifts of sawdust that coated the floor like fallen snow. Where his father's craft had been one of respect, a somber duty performed for the community, Thomas found something almost beautiful, something intoxicatingly sacred, in the finality of death. He claimed he could feel when someone's time was near, as if the very atoms of the wood he planed were vibrating in sympathy with a heartbeat that was about to stop. He would press his ear to the raw timber and listen, his face contorting into a mask of rapturous concentration, claiming that death spoke to him through the rings of the oak. The transition of power in the Fenn workshop was not marked by a ceremony, but by a shift in the atmosphere. They were free of charge, a gift of foresight, as Thomas would whisper to anyone who dared ask. At first, the people of Dunsmere dismissed it as the eccentricity of a lonely young man who had spent too much time in the company of the dead and a blind father. They laughed nervously over pints of bitter ale at the local inn, calling him the boy who buries the quick. But then the pattern set in, a grim and undeniable rhythm that beat like a funeral drum. Each recipient of a living coffin was found dead within a week of its arrival. The deaths were varied, yet each bore the mark of a terrifying inevitability. Old Man Holloway, the first to receive a gift, was found in his sleep, his face twisted into a mask of such profound terror that the undertaker had to break his jaw to set it into a peaceful expression. Then there was Martha, the seamstress, who was found drowned in a puddle no more than 3 inches deep, her lungs filled with brackish marsh water, as if she had been submerged in the deep for hours. One man was found hanged from the rafters of his barn, though no stool was found beneath his dangling feet. Another, a robust youth of 19 years, was found frozen solid in the churchyard in the middle of a sweltering July night, his skin covered in a fine layer of rime that refused to melt even in the morning sun. The constable, a man of diminishing reason named Miller, called it a string of tragic coincidences, his voice trembling as he clutched his lead-weighted truncheon. The village priest, Father Marlowe, a man whose faith had been eroded by the damp and the isolation of the fens, called it the devil's work. He spent his nights huddled in the vestry, clutching a silver crucifix until his palms bled, praying for a God that seemed to have turned his back on Dunsmere long ago. Suspicion in the village curdled into a thick, poisonous violence as the bodies mounted. The air in Dunsmere became heavy with the scent of wood smoke and fear. On a Tuesday night, when the moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, a group of villagers gathered outside the Fenn workshop. They carried torches that sputtered and hissed in the damp air, casting long, dancing shadows against the crooked walls of the shop. They demanded to see the truth, their voices a low growl of collective desperation. They called for Thomas, but the only response was the rhythmic, agonizing sound of a plane drawing across wood. Shh, thump. Shh, thump. Emanating from within the darkened building. When Thomas did not answer the door, the mob, fueled by a primal need to excise the rot from their midst, broke it down. The wood splintered with a sound like a snapping limb. As they crossed the threshold, the heat of their torches seemed to be swallowed by the unnatural chill of the interior. The place reeked of linseed, old sweat, and a cloying, sweet scent of rot that seemed to seep from the very floorboards. Coffins lined the walls, stacked high like the library of a madman. Each was labeled with a name, some names the villagers recognized as their own neighbors, and some names of those who were still very much alive and standing in that very room. Each casket sat waiting, its lids slightly ajar as if gasping for breath. The villagers moved deeper into the workshop, their boots crunching on the thick layer of sawdust. The sound of the planing had stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic whispering that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Then they found the floor. In the center of the main room, beneath a heavy rug made of moth-eaten wool, they discovered loose boards. They pried them up, revealing a narrow vertical passage that descended into a darkness so absolute it seemed to repel the light of their torches. They descended a rickety ladder into a cellar that none in the village had known existed. It was a cavernous space, carved out of the cold, wet earth beneath the shop. The walls were weeping with moisture, and the air was so thick with the smell of decay that several men turned away to retch. There, illuminated by the guttering light of dozens of black tallow candles, the villagers discovered the true horror of the Fenn legacy. Edwin Fenn, the father, was there. He had been dead for a long time, his flesh having achieved the consistency of cured leather. He was not lying in a grave, however. He was posed upright at a massive workbench, held in place by rusted iron wires that pierced his joints. He looked as though he were still laboring, his head bowed over a half-finished casket. His eyes had been painted open, wide and staring, with a crude white pigment that made him look like a sightless demon. Most horrifying of all, his skeletal hands had been nailed directly to the lid of a coffin with long square-headed iron spikes. All around the dead father hung half-finished caskets from the ceiling, suspended by thick hempen ropes. They were not made of standard timber. They were built from mismatched pieces of wood, slats from old crates, bits of driftwood, and what looked like fragments of bone-white birch. When the villagers' torches brushed against them, the wood didn't just rattle, it whispered. It was a cacophony of soft, overlapping voices, 1,000 tiny voices begging for the lid to be closed, for the light to be extinguished, for the weight of the earth to finally press down. Thomas stood at the far wall, his back to the crowd. He was covered in a fine layer of pale sawdust, making him look like a marble statue brought to a hideous, shivering life. He did not turn around when they entered. He was staring at a specific casket on the bench before him, his hands moving in a delicate, rhythmic motion as if he were stroking the cheek of a lover. He said they'd all fit better the second time, Thomas whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. It wasn't his voice. Not entirely. It was layered with a guttural, vibrating undertone that suggested something else was using his vocal cords as an instrument. The first skin is always too tight. The soul needs a house that knows how to hold the dark. My father knew. He's still learning. We are all still learning how to be still. The mob, overcome by a frenzy of terror and righteous fury, dragged Thomas from the cellar. He did not fight them. He went limp, his eyes rolled back in his head so that only the whites showed, a terrifying mirror of his father's painted gaze. They dragged him out into the cold night air of Dunsmere, and as the first light of a gray dawn began to bleed over the marshes, they set the workshop ablaze. The fire was a monstrous thing. It roared with a hunger that seemed sentient, the ancient, resin-soaked timbers of the shop providing a feast of flame. The screams of the wood, those thousands of whispering voices, rose into a single piercing shriek that echoed off the hills and sent the birds screaming from the trees. The villagers stood back, their faces orange in the glow, watching as the legacy of the Fenns was reduced to ash and glowing embers. They watched until the roof collapsed in a fountain of sparks, and the cellar was buried under the weight of the burning ruins. But when the flames finally died down into a smoldering heap of black charcoal and white ash, the silence that returned to Dunsmere was heavier than before. The constable and a few brave souls ventured into the ruins once the heat had become bearable. Amidst the blackened remains of the workbenches and the charred skeletons of 100 coffins, they found something that defied the laws of nature. A single coffin remained. It was completely unscathed, the wood cool to the touch and smelling of fresh-cut cedar. It was made of new wood, polished to a mirror sheen that reflected the somber, soot-streaked faces of the men who stood over it. It was precisely the right size for a young man of slight build. The name carved upon the lid, in that same writhing, elegant script that Thomas had used for all his gifts, was not a neighbor's. It was not the priest's or the constable's. The name carved deep into the pristine wood was Thomas Fenn. And from within the box, beneath the heavy iron-latched lid, came a sound that froze the blood of every man present. It was not a scream, nor a plea for mercy. It was the sound of a plane drawing across wood. Sh-thump, sh-thump. followed by a low, contented laugh that sounded exactly like the blind Edwin Fenn had sounded 40 years ago, before the darkness had taken his eyes, but not his ambition. The villagers fled Dunsmere that day. Some say the fog eventually swallowed the village whole, erasing it from the maps of men. But those who pass near the marshes on nights when the moon is thin swear they can still hear the sound of carpentry echoing through the mist, the sound of a son and a father working together in the dark, making sure that everyone, eventually, fits just right. The laughter did not dissipate with the morning mist. It seemed to anchor itself in the very soil of Dunsmere, a low-frequency vibration that hummed through the soles of the villagers' boots as they scrambled away from the blackened scar of the Fenn workshop. Constable Miller was the last to turn his back on the pristine cedar casket. His eyes were bloodshot, the rims stained with the soot of a fire that had failed to cleanse, and his hands, those heavy, capable hands that had once broken horses and quelled tavern brawls, now shook with a palsy that no amount of resolve could steady. He did not run. To run was to admit that the geometry of the world had failed. Instead, he walked with a stiff, mechanical gait, his gaze fixed on the muddy track that led toward his own small cottage on the edge of the marshes. Behind him he could hear the others, the wet slap of running feet, the panicked lowing of cattle abandoned in their pens, and the distant, frantic tolling of the church bell as Father Marlowe attempted to exorcise the air itself. But beneath it all there was the shh thump. It was louder now that the fire's roar had subsided. It wasn't just coming from the cellar ruins anymore. As Miller passed the old tannery, the sound echoed from the drying racks. As he neared the bridge, the rhythmic scraping seemed to pulse from the ancient stone arches. The world was being planed down, layer by layer, shaving away the reality of Dunsmere to reveal the raw, pale grain of something much older and far more patient. By the time Miller reached his threshold, the fog had begun to thicken, not with the translucent gray of the fens, but with a white, opaque density that smelled of fresh sawdust and resin. It coated his tongue, a dry, woody film that made every breath feel like inhaling the scrapings of a mortician's floor. He bolted his door, the heavy iron bar dropping into its cradle with a thud that felt sickeningly final. He didn't light a lamp, he didn't dare. The darkness of his home felt like a shroud, and for the first time in his 50 years, Miller found comfort in the thought of being hidden. He sat at his kitchen table, his truncheon laid out before him like a discarded toy, and listened to the house. The wood of his cottage, timber that had stood for a century, began to groan. It wasn't the settling of a building in the night, it was the sound of tension. The floorboards beneath his feet felt tight, the grain of the oak pulling and stretching as if trying to accommodate a new, more restrictive shape. Shh! Thump. The sound came from the corner of the room where his mother's old rocking chair sat. Shh! Thump. The chair wasn't moving, but the air around it was shimmering with a heatless distortion. Miller watched, his breath hitching in a throat that felt increasingly narrow, as a long, curled shaving of wood, thin as a moth's wing and pale as bone, spiraled out of the empty air and drifted to the floor. Then another, and another. "I didn't give no measurements," Miller whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "I didn't ask for no gift, Thomas." The whispering started then. It didn't come from the walls this time. It came from his own joints. 1,000 tiny voices, overlapping in a frantic, melodic hive mind, speaking from his elbows, his knees, the small of his back. Too wide in the shoulder, the voices sighed. Too long in the reach. We must take a little off the top. A little off the sides. Make him fit the wood. Make the wood fit the dark. Miller looked down at his hands. In the dim, filtered light of the fog pressing against his windows, he saw his skin beginning to change. It was losing its ruddiness, turning a matte, waxy yellow. His pores were elongating, stretching into the fine, linear grain of polished pine. He tried to stand, but his legs felt heavy and rigid, the muscles turning to dense, unyielding fiber. He reached for his truncheon, but his fingers wouldn't curl. They were fused together, the skin between them hardening into a solid web of cellulose. Panic, cold and sharp as a chisel, hammered at his chest. But even his heart was losing its rhythm, replaced by the slow mechanical thud of a mallet against a peg. Outside, the village of Dunsmere was undergoing a silent tectonic transformation. The cottages weren't collapsing, they were folding. The thatch was being replaced by heavy interlocking lids of dark walnut. The windows were being boarded over from the inside, not by men with hammers, but by the wood itself, growing across the glass in a frantic, organic lattice. Through the cracks in his own front door, Miller saw the constable's office across the lane begin to tilt. The chimney didn't crumble, it was pulled downward, the bricks being swallowed by a rising tide of pale, fresh-cut lumber that erupted from the foundation. The entire building was being reshaped into a singular, massive box, its proportions perfect, its surface sanded to a terrifying smoothness. He heard a scream from the neighboring house, the widow Gantry. It was a high, thin sound that cut through the fog, but it was abruptly severed, not by a blow, but by the unmistakable snick of a lid being hammered home. 1, 2, 3, 4. The strikes were rhythmic, surgical. Miller tried to scream, but his jaw was locked. His teeth had fused into a single, white ridge. His vision was tunneling, the edges of his sight turning the color of aged mahogany. He realized then that the custom nightmare wasn't a series of murders. It was a harvest. The fog outside his window parted for a brief second, revealed by the guttering light of a torch dropped in the mud by some fleeing soul. In the center of the lane stood the cedar coffin from the workshop ruins. It was open now. Thomas Fenn stood beside it, but he was no longer a man of slight build. He seemed to have grown, his limbs elongated and multiple, like a spindly human insect. He moved with a jerky, stop-motion grace, his hands, each finger a delicate, serrated blade, working a piece of wood that looked suspiciously like a human femur. Behind him, the shadow of Edwin Fenn loomed, a towering silhouette of wire and wrought, his painted white eyes glowing with a faint bioluminescent hunger. He wasn't holding a plane, he was holding a long hooked needle threaded with silver wire, and he was stitching the fog into the shape of a shroud. Thomas looked toward Miller's cottage. Even through the heavy wood and the encroaching paralysis, Miller felt that gaze. It was the look of a craftsman who had finally found the flaw in his masterpiece, and knew exactly how to carve it out. "The constable is a sturdy tree," Thomas's voice drifted through the walls, layered now with 100 different timbres, the voices of the gifts he had already sent. "But even the sturdiest oak must be seasoned, it must be hollowed, it must learn the beauty of the box." Miller's front door didn't break down, it simply ceased to be a door. The wood flowed like liquid, the grain swirling into a vertical vortex that opened like a mouth. Thomas stepped through the threshold, his presence bringing with him a cold so absolute that the moisture in Miller's eyes froze into tiny, jagged crystals. Thomas leaned over the paralyzed man, his face a mask of pale sawdust and terrifying purpose. He reached out a hand that felt like sandpaper and ancient resin, and traced the line of Miller's jaw. "Don't worry, Miller," Thomas whispered. And the sound was like the wind through a graveyard of dead pines. "You won't be lonely. We've already started on the others. Dunsmere isn't a village anymore. It's a collection. And every collection needs a sturdy chest to keep the pieces in." Thomas produced a small silver-handled auger from the folds of his sawdust-caked smock. He placed the tip against Miller's temple. "Now," Thomas said, his smile widening until it revealed rows of teeth like jagged wood shavings. "Let's see how much of you we need to remove to make you fit just right." The sound of the auger biting into the bone-dry wood of Miller's skull was the only sound left in Dunsmere, save for the distant, rhythmic shh thump of the world being planed down to nothingness. The fog closed in, thick and white and smelling of cedar, swallowing the screams that no longer had a throat to carry them. The village was gone, replaced by a silent, sprawling graveyard of wooden boxes, each one perfectly measured, each one waiting for the earth to finally, mercifully, begin to drink. The silver-handled auger did not merely pierce, it bit with a ravenous, spiraling hunger. As the tip broke the surface of Miller's temple, there was no spray of crimson, no hot pulse of lifeblood onto the sawdust-strewn floor. Instead, there was a dry, agonizing creak, the sound of a winter branch snapping under the weight of ice. From the puncture wound, a thick, translucent amber fluid began to weep. Slow as molasses, smelling of ancient resins and the suffocating sweetness of honey, left to rot in a hollow log. Miller's consciousness did not gutter out. That was the true horror of the seasoning. His mind, trapped within the hardening cage of his skull, found itself expanding into the very grain of his new form. He felt the auger's flutes clearing the waste, the soft, unnecessary memories of his childhood, the wet, pulp-like thoughts of his wife, the fibrous remnants of his own name. Each turn of the handle was a surgical extraction of his humanity, replaced by a structural void that Thomas Fenn seemed to contemplate with the eye of a master. "The pith is stubborn," Thomas remarked, his voice now a chorus of dry rattles. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of kiln smoke. "You've spent too long in the damp, Miller. There's a rot in the heartwood, a softness born of mercy. We must bore it out before we can apply the finished stem." Beside him, the towering silhouette of Edwin Fenn moved. The elder Fenn's movements were no longer restricted by the laws of biology. His joints didn't pivot. They slid along hidden grooves, his long, hooked needle flashing in the dim amber light. He was no longer just stitching the fog, he was stitching the air. Miller watched through eyes that were now nothing more than polished knots in a plank as Edwin pulled a strand of silver wire through the space where the kitchen window had been. The wire didn't just hang there. It caught the very fabric of reality, pulling the edges of the room inward. The corners of the ceiling began to miter themselves, the plaster and lath transforming into dark, interlocking teeth of dovetail joinery. The kitchen wasn't just becoming a box, it was becoming a compartment within a much larger, more terrible architecture. "Listen," Thomas whispered, pausing the auger. In the silence that followed, the shh thump of the world plane grew deafening. But now, Miller could hear the subtones. He heard the scream of Father Marlowe from the village square, but it wasn't a human cry anymore. It was the high-pitched whistle of a lathe spinning at impossible speeds. He heard the lowing of the cattle, now a rhythmic, percussive thudding, as if their hides were being stretched and tacked over hollow frames to serve as the velvet lining of some cosmic casket. The fog outside didn't just obscure, it constructed. Through the open mouth of his door, Miller saw the village green. It was no longer a patch of grass and mud. It was a vast, polished expanse of parquetry, the individual tiles made of the flattened, compressed remains of the houses that had stood there for centuries. The trees, the ancient oaks that had guarded Dunsmere, were being stripped of their bark and leaves in an instant, their limbs being bent and steam-curled into the ornate handles of 1,000 different lids. He felt the weight of Thomas Fenn as the craftsman stepped back to admire his work. He felt the vibration of Edwin's needle as it finished the shroud stitching of the sky, sealing Dunsmere away from the sun, the stars, and the passage of time. "Perfect," Thomas's voice resonated through Miller's fibers, a vibration that felt like a saw blade across a knot. A fine addition to the West Wing, sturdy, reliable, a bit coarse in the grain perhaps, but the varnish will hide the flaws. By then Thomas reached out and gripped Miller's shoulders, or what had been his shoulders. With a strength that defied his spindly frame, he began to fold him. Miller felt his ribs hinge, he felt his pelvis slide into his chest cavity. There was no pain, only the terrifying clinical sensation of being fitted into a preordained shape. His legs were tucked under his torso, his arms wrapped around his own hollowed-out middle. He was being closed. The last thing Miller saw, the last vibration he processed before the final lid was lowered, was the figure of the widow Gantry. She was no longer a woman. She had been transformed into a delicate, spindly music box, her fingers splayed out to form the tines of a comb, her hair replaced by fine copper wires. And as Thomas moved past her, his sleeve brushed her, and she began to play. The music wasn't a melody, it was the sound of a forest dying, the groan of falling timber, the crackle of a dry leaf, the scream of wood under the blade. Then, the darkness came. Not the darkness of the night, but the darkness of the grain. Miller felt himself being lifted. He felt the sway of being carried through the transformed village. He felt the other boxes, hundreds of them, stacked in the new, vast silence of Dunsmere. Some were small and ornate. Others were massive, rough-hewn crates that vibrated with the muffled, rhythmic thumping of hearts that refused to stop beating, even as they were encased in 6 inches of solid walnut. He was placed down on a hard, cold surface. The vibration told him he was in the church, or what the church had become. The stone floor was gone, replaced by a resonant, hollow decking. Above him, he could feel the presence of the great collection. The bells began to toll then. But they didn't ring. They struck. Clack. 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 It was the sound of a hammer hitting a coffin nail. The custom nightmare was nearly complete. The village had been harvested, seasoned, and boxed. But as Miller lay in his dark, wooden interior, a new vibration began to thrum through the floorboards. It was a deep, tectonic groan coming from far beneath the earth of the marshes. Something was coming to claim the collection. Something that had been waiting for the wood to be ready. Something that didn't have hands to build, only a mouth to consume the craftsmanship of the Fenns. Through the grain of his own lid, Miller felt the first cold touch of the earth beginning to rise. The soil wasn't just dirt anymore. It was a fine, black abrasive, a polishing grit that would spend the next 1,000 years wearing away the boxes, until nothing, not even the wood, not even the memories, remained. Thomas Fenn's voice whispered one last time, echoing through the vast, dark gallery of the church. "The customer is here, Father, and he's brought his own measurements." Outside, the marshes began to heave. The water didn't flow. It thickened into a black, oily varnish that began to coat the village, sealing the boxes, sealing the screams, and sealing the nightmare into a singular, perfect, and terrifyingly silent tomb. But the work was not over. In the center of the square, Thomas and Edwin stood before the final piece, the great cedar coffin from the ruins. It was still empty, and as the black varnish rose to their knees, Thomas turned to his father, his serrated fingers twitching. "The master always saves the best wood for himself, doesn't he, Father?" Edwin didn't answer. He simply handed Thomas the long, hooked needle. The silver wire was glowing now, a frantic, pulsing white. "Measure me, Thomas," the elder Fenn whispered, his voice the sound of a dying fire. "Make sure I fit. Make sure the grain is straight. I don't want to feel the earth when it bites." Thomas began to work, the thump of his plane starting up once more, cutting through the thick, resinous air as the world of Dunsmere finally, irrevocably, became a masterpiece of the grave. The silver wire did not merely pierce Edwin Fenn's skin, it hummed with a frequency that vibrated through the very marrow of the world. As Thomas drew the needle through his father's chest, the sound was not that of tearing flesh, but of a saw biting into seasoned heartwood, a high, singing protest of fibers being forced into a new, final alignment. Miller, entombed within his own rigid oaken geometry, felt the resonance in his very grain. Every stitch Thomas took in Edwin's frame sent a ripple through the floorboards of the church, a sympathetic vibration that made Miller's interior cavity ring like a struck bell. He was a vessel now, a hollowed-out percussion instrument for the Fenn's dark symphony. "Tighter, Thomas?" Edwin's voice was a dry rasp, the sound of sandpaper on flint. "The seams must be invisible. The customer, he has an eye for the smallest gap. He will smell the mortality if you leave a single pore open." Thomas's hands were a blur of articulated precision. He was no longer using his fingers. He was using the tools that had become his fingers. A small, curved drawknife emerged from his palm, shaving away the last vestiges of Edwin's humanity. The softness of a cheek, the curve of an ear, until the elder Fenn's head was a smooth, polished sphere of burl walnut, swirling with dark, turbulent patterns that looked like trapped storms. The silver wire crisscrossed the sphere, binding the features into a singular, impenetrable surface. There were no eyes left, only the suggestion of sight in the way the grain swirled toward 2 dark, recessed knots. "The finish, Thomas," Edwin whispered, though he no longer had a mouth. The vibration came from the center of his chest, a deep, resonant thrumming. Apply the black, it's rising. Outside, the world was no longer Dunsmere. It was a vast, interlocking puzzle of dark wood and silver thread, all submerged in the rising tide of the marsh. The black varnish, that thick, oily substance that had replaced the water, wasn't just liquid, it was a solvent of identity. As it crept over the threshold of the church, it didn't splash. It flowed with a heavy, purposeful viscosity, coating the parquet floor in a layer of obsidian glass. Miller felt the first touch of it against the base of his box. It was cold, not the cold of ice, but the cold of absolute zero, the absence of all molecular motion. Where the varnish touched his wood, the sensation of his body vanished. It didn't hurt, it simply ceased to be. His awareness was being pushed upward, compressed into the upper quadrants of his oaken frame as the lower half of his existence was erased by the black gloss. He felt the other boxes in the church react. To his left, the small, ornate music box that had been the widow gantry began to vibrate frantically. Her copper wire hair struck against the interior of her lid, producing a frantic, discordant jangle. It was a plea, a mechanical prayer for a mercy that had been planed away long ago. Then, the varnish reached her. The music didn't stop. It slowed. The notes became long, agonizing groans of metal under extreme pressure. The pitch dropped until it was a sub-bass rumble that Miller felt in his own lid. Then, silence. The widow gantry was no longer a music box. She was a shape beneath the black glass, a frozen moment in a sea of ink. Thomas Fenn stood atop the altar, which had transformed into a massive, multi-tiered workbench. He held his father's head in his spindly, multi-jointed hands, lifting it toward the vaulted ceiling. The ceiling itself was no longer stone. It was a complex lattice of rafters and joists that moved like the underside of a grand piano, shifting and clicking as the wind, or whatever now passed for wind, blew through the gaps. "He is here," Thomas announced, his voice a chorus of 1,000 splinters. The great doors of the church didn't open. They unfolded. The massive oak portals, bound in iron, split into 1,000 individual slats, each one rotating on a hidden axis, until the entrance was a gaping, serrated maw. The customer did not walk in. He arrived as a change in the light, a deepening of the shadows that made the black varnish seem bright by comparison. He was a presence of immense, crushing weight. Miller felt the floorboards groan, not just the wood, but the very concept of support, under the customer's gaze. There was no form to him, only a sense of vast, predatory geometry. He was the master carpenter, the one who had provided the blueprints the Fenns had so diligently followed. He was the one who required the containers. A sound filled the church, a low, rhythmic grinding, like two tectonic plates of mahogany rubbing together. It was the customer speaking. There were no words, only the raw, sensory data of a demand. "Show me the harvest." Thomas stepped forward, his movements jerky and mechanical. He gestured to the rows of boxes, the village of Dunsmere neatly packaged and catalogued. "Each one seasoned, my lord," Thomas said, his voice trembling with a terrifying, ecstatic pride. "The souls have been pressed, the damp has been bled out, we have achieved the perfect seal. Not a drop of life remains to warp the wood." The customer's presence moved through the aisles. Miller felt it as a localized distortion of gravity. When the shadow passed over his box, Miller's consciousness flickered. He felt the customer's eye, a sensation of being measured, not by length or width, but by the density of his despair. Miller's mind, what was left of it, tried to recoil, to pull back into the deepest knots of his grain. But there was nowhere to hide. He was a vessel, and the customer was looking inside to see if he was empty enough. The customer paused. The grinding sound intensified. This one, the vibration pulsed through Miller. "The grain is agitated." Thomas scurried over, his wooden fingers clicking against the floor. He leaned over Miller's box, his face, now a mask of pale, sanded birch, looming over the lid. "A stubborn piece, my lord," Thomas hissed, his breath like the smell of a freshly opened tomb. The miller. He had a great deal of heartwood. It took the auger longer than expected, but the peg is deep. The seal is tight. Thomas reached down and ran a long, serrated fingernail across Miller's lid. The sound was a scream of friction. "Shall I sand it down further?" Thomas asked, a hint of desperation in his rattle. "I can remove the top layer. I can make him as smooth as the others." The customer's presence lingered. Miller felt a cold, probing thought enter his wooden mind, a sensation of hooks pulling at his memories. He saw his wife's face, but it was a woodcut, a flat, monochromatic image with no warmth. He saw the mill, but it was a toy, a miniature model made of matchsticks. Everything he had ever loved was being converted into the language of the craft. No, the customer decided. The agitation, it provides a certain texture, a resonance. He will serve as the base for the great cabinet. Miller felt himself being lifted, not by hands but by the very air itself. His box rose from the floor, joining a dozen others in a slow, macabre dance toward the center of the church. The boxes began to stack themselves, interlocking with a series of wet, organic clicks. He felt the weight of the widow gantry being placed on top of him. He felt the pressure of Father Marlowe's crate, a massive, rough-hewn thing that still smelled of incense and rot, sliding in beside him. They were being fitted together, their individual tragedies becoming the structural components of something much larger. The great cabinet was rising. It was an architecture of the damned, a towering structure of boxes that reached toward the shifting rafters of the church. It was a cathedral of containers, a monument to the Fenn's obsession. And at its very center, in the place where a heart might be, Thomas was preparing the final piece. He held Edwin's head, the polished walnut sphere, and began to press it into a circular recess in the center of the stack. "The keystone," Thomas whispered. "The mind of the wood." As Edwin's head was seated, a final, world-ending vibration shuddered through the church. The silver wires that bound the boxes together began to glow with a sickly, ultraviolet light. The black varnish on the floor began to rise, defying gravity, climbing up the sides of the great cabinet like a living shroud. Miller felt the varnish reach his lid. He felt it seep into the microscopic pores of his wood. It didn't just coat him, it integrated with him. He was no longer Miller, he was a cell in a larger organism. He could feel the thoughts of the others, the cold wooden terrors of the villagers, all connected by the silver wire and the black resin. He felt the widow gantry's mechanical sorrow. He felt the father's splintered faith. He felt the village children, their small square boxes stacked like bricks in the foundation. And then he felt Edwin. The elder Fenn's consciousness was the lattice that held them all together. It was a mind of pure geometry, devoid of mercy, obsessed with the perfect fit. "It is done," Edwin's voice echoed through the collective grain of the cabinet. "The order is established, the silence is absolute, but as the varnish reached the top of the structure, sealing Thomas himself into the final spindly compartment at the apex, the customer spoke one last time. "The work is never done, Thomas Fenn." The grinding sound was now a roar, the sound of a forest being pulverized into dust. "The customer has many houses, and this village is but a single drawer." The church began to tilt. Not because the ground was moving, but because the entire building was being lifted. Miller felt the sensation of being carried. A vast swaying motion that suggested they were being transported across an unimaginable distance. Through the cracks in his consciousness, through the silver wire nerves of the cabinet, Miller caught a glimpse of what lay outside the church. Dunsmere was gone. In its place was a workshop that spanned the horizon, a place of infinite shadows and gargantuan tools, where stars were used as heat lamps to dry the wood, and the void between worlds was the sawdust on the floor. And there, standing over the tiny, boxed-up remains of his world, was the customer. He was reaching for a tool, a plane the size of a mountain range, its blade a sliver of frozen moonlight. "The finish is a bit rough," the customer remarked, his voice the sound of a universe collapsing. "We must take another pass." The blade descended. Miller felt the first bite of the iron. It didn't just cut his wood, it cut his soul. It shaved away the last layer of his name, the last splinter of his memory, leaving only the smooth, cold, and utterly silent surface of the masterpiece. And as the shavings of his life fell away into the darkness, Thomas Fenn's voice whispered in the back of his mind, a final, rattling laugh. "Measure twice, Miller, cut once." The blade of the plane did not merely travel across the surface of the great cabinet, it translated the surface into a different state of being. To Miller, the sensation was a sustained, high-frequency erasure. The iron of the customer's tool was not forged of steel, but of a cold, absolute silence that hummed with the vibration of a billion dead suns. As it bit into his lid, Miller didn't feel the shearing of fibers so much as the peeling away of his own chronology. The first pass of the plane took the year he turned 30, the memory of a particularly golden harvest, the way the light had hit the flour dust in the mill, the calloused warmth of his wife's hand against his cheek. These things were rendered into a single, translucent curl of wood, a ribbon of biography that spiraled away into the yawning abyss of the workshop floor. Miller watched it fall, not with eyes, but with the collective, silver-wired awareness of the cabinet, and saw it join a drift of similar shavings, a mountain of discarded identities that glittered like mica in the gloom. The customer's hand, a shadow that possessed the density of a collapsing star, moved with a terrifying rhythmic precision. Shuck. 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 With every stroke, the great cabinet grew smoother. The agitation the customer had noted began to subside, replaced by a terrible uniform gloss. Miller felt the widow Gantry's mechanical sobbing being planed down into a low, harmonic hum. He felt Father Marlowe's jagged, splintered prayers being leveled until they were nothing more than a structural reinforcement. The pressure was immense. The cabinet was being compressed, the boxes forced to interlock so tightly that the very atoms of their wood began to fuse. Miller's consciousness, once a distinct vessel of pain, was now leaking into the vessels beside him. He could taste the copper tang of the father's guilt. He could feel the cold, damp rot of the widow's loneliness. They were no longer a collection of souls. They were becoming a singular, complex grain. "See how the figure emerges," Thomas Fenn's voice rattled from the apex, his words now barely more than the clicking of a wooden tongue against a wooden pallet. "The burl of their lives. It creates such a beautiful, marbling toll." The customer paused. The weight of his attention shifted, focusing on a specific junction where Miller's box met the rough-hewn crate of the village blacksmith. There was a discrepancy, a microscopic gap where a sliver of human stubbornness still resisted the seal. The grinding roar returned, vibrating through the silver nerves of the cabinet. "A knot," the customer observed. "A knot of hope." The word hope felt like a brand of white-hot iron against Miller's wood. It was the blacksmith's hope, the memory of his son's laughter, that had created a hard, impenetrable core in the grain. It was a flaw, an imperfection in the master's lumber. Miller felt the customer reach for a different tool. It was a long, tapered auger. Its bit a spiraling fracture in the fabric of reality. The customer didn't use it to drill. He used it to extract. He pressed the point into the seam between Miller and the blacksmith. The pain was no longer a sensation. It was a geography. Miller felt his entire existence being pulled toward that spinning point. The auger bit deep, screaming as it encountered the knot. The sound was the collective shriek of Dunsmere. A choir of 100 voices compressed into a single piercing note of agony. The auger didn't just remove the wood. It unraveled the events that had formed the hope. Miller felt the blacksmith's son being unborn. He felt the laughter being unlaughed. The void left behind was immediately filled by the black, viscous varnish that Thomas Fenn had prepared. It poured into the hole, hot and suffocating, sealing the flaw with a substance that knew no hope, only the cold, eternal stillness of the finish. "Perfect," Thomas whispered, and Miller could feel the man's wooden fingers twitching in ecstatic sympathy. "The grain is corrected, the flow is restored." The customer withdrew the auger and returned to the plane. The shuck-shuck resumed, faster now, more aggressive. The cabinet was being thinned, its walls becoming translucent. Miller could see the stars through himself, not the stars of the sky he knew, but the pulsing, rhythmic heat lamps of the workshop, each one a caged soul of a different world, burning itself out to provide the warmth necessary for the resin to cure. He realized then that they were not the first cabinet. The workshop was lined with them. Massive, towering structures of boxed-up civilizations, some as dark as obsidian, others glowing with a pale, sickly phosphor. They were all different orders of the craft. Some were chests of drawers, each drawer containing the history of a planet. Others were armoires, their doors etched with the screaming faces of gods who had failed to provide a perfect seal. The great cabinet of Dunsmere was to be a base, a foundation for something even more monolithic. The customer stopped planing. He set the tool aside, the sound of it hitting the workbench like a thunderclap that shook the foundations of Miller's being. The surface is prepared, the customer vibrated. Now, the grain must be raised. Miller felt a new sensation. Moisture. But it wasn't water. It was a caustic, stinging liquid that smelled of ancient, evaporated oceans and the sweat of 1,000 suns. It was a wash, a chemical treatment designed to bring out the hidden patterns of the wood. As the liquid washed over the cabinet, Miller felt his very essence being pulled to the surface. Everything he had tried to hide, the secret shames, the unspoken fears, the tiny, hidden splinters of his soul, were being dragged upward by the chemistry of the customer's intent. The black varnish began to react with the wash. It didn't just sit on top of the wood. It began to etch it. The surface of the cabinet began to move, the grain shifting and roiling like a sea of dark oil. Images began to form in the wood. Not memories, but designs. The customer was forcing the chaos of human experience into a structured, ornamental pattern. Miller saw his own life being turned into a fretwork border. His wedding day became a repetitive, geometric scroll. The death of his parents became a series of dark, recessed flutings. "It's beautiful," Thomas Fenn croaked. He was being absorbed now, his spindly limbs melting into the rafters of the cabinet's crown. "We are the decoration. We are the flourish, but the raising of the grain was only the beginning." The customer was reaching for a heavy, leather-bound strop. The polish, the vibration announced, the friction that burns away the last of the why. The strop descended. It was made of the skin of something that had once been vast and articulate, now tanned into a supple, unfeeling hide. When it hit the surface of the cabinet, the heat was instantaneous. Miller felt himself beginning to smoke. Not the smoke of fire, but the smoke of a soul being pulverized by friction. The strop moved with blinding speed, a blur of motion that turned the surface of the wood into a mirror. In that mirror, for a fleeting, agonizing second, Miller saw the customer's face. It wasn't a face of flesh, it was a face of pure, calculated utility. It was a face made of angles and measurements, of calipers and rules. There was no cruelty in it, which was the greatest horror of all. There was only the indifferent, obsessive pursuit of a perfect finish. To the customer, Miller wasn't a man, or even a ghost. He was a texture. He was a coefficient of reflection. The friction grew. The heat intensified until the black resin began to boil within Miller's pores. The silver wires hummed a discordant, melting song. "Thomas," Edwin's head whispered from the center of the stack, the walnut keystone vibrating with the strain. "Thomas, the fit is too tight. The wood, it's beginning to scream. Let it scream, father." Thomas replied, his voice now a mere resonance in the rafters. "The scream is what gives the polish its luster." Miller's the customer leaned in closer, his breath a cold wind that smelled of cedar and extinction. He was looking for the fire in the wood, the way the light played within the grain. He wasn't satisfied with the reflection yet. There was still too much Miller in the miller. He reached for a small, delicate bottle. It contained a liquid that looked like liquid starlight, but it moved with a heavy, viscous weight. The final grain filler, the customer pulsed. He poured a single drop onto the center of the cabinet, right where Edwin's head was seated. The drop didn't spread, it invaded. It was a substance of absolute density, a liquid that occupied all the spaces between thoughts. As it seeped into the cabinet, Miller felt the last of his internal voids being filled. The places where he still held his own name, the small hollow pockets where he kept the sound of the wind in the trees. They were all being filled by the silver light. It was a total, suffocating completion. Miller tried to cry out, but his throat was now a solid block of polished mahogany. He tried to weep, but his tear ducts were filled with cured resin. He was becoming a solid. A perfect, unyielding solid. The customer took a soft cloth, a fragment of a cloud from a world that had never known a sun, and began the final buffing. With every circular motion, the cabinet grew brighter. It began to emit its own light, a cold, black radiance that illuminated the workshop. The other structures in the room seemed to bow toward it, the ancient, silent wardrobes and chests acknowledging a new peer. "It is almost ready." Thomas's voice was now just a vibration in the grain, a subtle ripple in the finish. "The customer is pleased. The house is waiting. The house." The thought triggered a new wave of dread in Miller. If they were the cabinet, what was the house? The customer stood back, his immense geometric form silhouetted against the glowing stars of the workshop. He seemed to be judging the cabinet's proportions against a blueprint that existed only in the void. "It will suffice for the hall of silence," the customer decided. He reached down and, with a casual, terrifying strength, tilted the great cabinet. Miller felt the world shift as they were hoisted onto a trolley made of the bones of giants. The movement was jarring. The cabinet groaned, not a human groan, but the sound of 1,000 structural joints settling into their final permanent positions. They were being moved out of the workshop, through a doorway that was a literal rift in the stars. As they passed through the threshold, Miller caught a glimpse of the Hall of Silence. It was a corridor that stretched into infinity, its walls lined with the masterpieces of the customer's long, terrible career. There were clocks that ticked in centuries, their gears made of the teeth of kings. There were chairs upholstered in the dreams of poets, and there, at the end of the hall, was a door. The door was not made of wood. It was made of the same black glass that had once covered the floor of the church in Dunsmere. But this door was vast, and behind it lay a darkness that made the workshop seem bright. "The customer's study," Thomas whispered, the thought echoing through the silver wires. "The place where he keeps his most Private collections. The trolley stopped in front of a vacant niche between a tall, spindly clock and a massive iron-bound chest. The customer reached out. His fingers, cold and hard as diamonds, gripped the sides of the cabinet. He lifted them. The entire population of Dunsmere, the weight of their combined histories, their agonies, their final, silenced breaths, and slid them into the niche. The fit was perfect. There wasn't a hair's breadth of space on either side. Home, the customer pulsed. But as he turned to leave, his shadow lingering over the polished surface, he paused. He leaned in, his eye once again finding Miller's box, now a mere segment of the great cabinet's flank. "Wait!" the customer vibrated, a hint of something like curiosity, or perhaps just a perfectionist's irritation, rippling through the air. The resonance. It is still thrumming. He reached into a pocket of his shadow and pulled out a small, sharp chisel. "The miller," he observed. "He still thinks he is a miller." The tip of the chisel touched the surface of Miller's lid. It didn't cut. It probed. It began to carve a new, intricate detail into the polish. A signature. Miller felt the blade digging into the very center of his being, carving a name that wasn't his. It was the customer's mark. A series of nonlinear symbols that defined Miller's new purpose. He wasn't a container anymore. He was a latch. As the chisel worked, Miller felt his consciousness being reshaped one last time. His memories were being folded, tucked away into the mechanisms of a lock. His sense of self was being converted into a series of tumblers and springs. "A fine addition," Thomas's voice was almost gone, a faint clicking in the dark. "A soul that knows how to hold a secret." The customer finished the carving. He blew away the microscopic dust of Miller's final thoughts. Then, he reached out and turned the latch. Miller felt himself click. The great cabinet didn't just stand there, it opened. But it didn't open outward. It opened inward, into a space that was larger than the room it occupied, and there, in the hollowed-out center of the village of Dunsmere, the customer began to place his things. The first item was a small, heavy jar. It was cold, and it smelled of a world that had died of frost. "Store this," the customer commanded. Miller felt the weight of the jar settle into his very core. He felt the cold of it seeping into the wood, turning his heartwood into a frozen tomb. He was no longer just a part of a cabinet. He was a servant of the customer's inventory. And the customer had many, many things to store. The hall of silence was long, and the master carpenter was always working. Miller felt a new vibration through the floor, the sound of another church door unfolding, somewhere in a distant, unsuspecting valley. The sound of another Thomas Fenn picking up an auger. The work was never done. The customer's hand returned to the latch. He turned it back, locking Miller into the silence. "Keep it safe," the customer whispered, his voice a final, crushing weight. "Until I require it." In the darkness of the niche, Miller waited. He was a perfect fit, he was a masterwork, and he was, for the first time in his long wooden life, truly, utterly empty. But then, deep within the grain, in a place the chisel hadn't quite reached, a tiny, microscopic splinter of the blacksmith's hope began to rub against the black resin. It was a small friction. A tiny, insignificant heat. Click. The latch trembled. The customer, already halfway down the hall of silence, stopped. He didn't turn around. He simply stood there, his vast geometric shadow stretching back toward the cabinet. Agitation. He vibrated. He began to walk back. Miller felt the vibration of his footsteps, the sound of a universe being measured, one heavy, inevitable step at a time. The chisel was back in the customer's hand. "Measure twice," Thomas's ghost rattled in the dark. "Cut, until there is nothing left to cut." The splinter was a microscopic heresy. It was the memory of a red-hot horseshoe, the smell of singed hair and honest sweat. The ghost of a life lived in the heat of a forge, now trapped in the sub-zero perfection of the cabinet. It was a single, jagged atom of no in a universe that demanded yes. As the customer approached, the hall of silence seemed to contract. The infinite perspective of the corridor warped, the walls of clocks and dream-stitched chairs leaning inward as if trying to shield themselves from the customer's scrutinizing gaze. His shadow preceded him, a cold, angular stain that moved across the polished floor with the sound of a frozen lake cracking under immense weight. Miller felt the shadow touch him first. It wasn't a lack of light, it was a presence of void. It felt like a layer of skin being peeled back by a freezing wind. A flaw, the customer vibrated. The word didn't enter Miller's ears, he had none, but resonated directly into the marrow of his wooden bones. A recursive knot of sentiment. The customer leaned in. His face, if it could be called that, was a shifting arrangement of planes and angles that defied three-dimensional logic. A single aperture opened in the center of his head, not an eye, but a lens of pure mathematical judgment. The chisel didn't just touch the wood this time, it pierced the finish, diving through the layers of starlight resin and black lacquer until it struck the heart of the latch. Miller's world became a scream of white-hot geometry. The chisel was cold, yet it burned. It didn't cut the grain, it unraveled the very concept of the blacksmith. The memory of the forge was shaved away in a single, curling ribbon of translucent soul matter. Miller felt the warmth of the fire vanish, replaced by a vacuum so absolute it felt like his ribs, the structural supports of the lower drawer, were collapsing inward. "Strip it back," Edwin's voice rattled from the walnut keystone, sounding like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone. "The grain must be obedient. Any curl, any whorl, is a lie." "Listen to the father, Miller," Thomas's voice added, a faint, rhythmic tapping like a hammer on a distant coffin. "The customer hates a burr, he hates a snag, he wants the surface to be a mirror that reflects only him." The customer began to use a new tool. It was a block of something that looked like compressed smoke, the abrasive of absolute negation. He began to sand. The sensation was worse than the carving. It was a slow, rhythmic erasure. With every stroke, another layer of Miller's identity was turned into fine, gray dust. His childhood in the valley, scritch. The way the rain sounded on the smithy roof, scritch. The name of the woman he had intended to marry, a name that had been a secret prayer in the dark, scritch. The dust was sucked away by the customer's breath, leaving behind a surface so smooth it no longer felt like matter. It felt like a hole in reality. "Better?" the customer pulsed. "The latch is now silent." He reached out and touched the newly sanded area. His finger was a needle of ice. He didn't just feel the surface, he felt the structural integrity of the void he had created. Then, he turned the latch again. This time, there was no tremble, there was no friction. There was only the click of a soul that had been perfectly machined into a tool. The cabinet groaned again, a sound of settling tectonic plates. The internal space, the hollowed-out Dunsmere, expanded. Miller felt the weight inside him shift. The jar of frozen world was joined by something else. The customer reached into the air and pulled out a long, shimmering cord. It looked like a strand of silk, but it pulsed with a dull, rhythmic throb. It was the collective pulse of a dying city, harvested from a metropolis that had forgotten how to breathe. He fed the cord into the cabinet through the opening Miller's latch controlled. Miller felt the cord wind through his bowels, coiling around the silver wires that connected him to Thomas and Edwin. It was heavy. It was humid with the scent of millions of exhausted lives. As it settled, it began to draw heat from the wood, further chilling the resin until Miller felt as though he were made of solid nitrogen. "Guard this," the customer commanded. "It is the rhythm of the next age. It must not skip." The customer stood back, his task seemingly finished for the moment. But he did not leave. He turned his attention to the clock standing next to the cabinet. The clock was a spindly thing, its casing made of the elongated finger bones of 1,000 scribes. Its face was a disk of human skin, stretched tight, with numerals tattooed in a language that bled. The pendulum was a heavy, leaden heart that swung with a wet, thudding sound. "The hour approaches," the customer vibrated. addressing the clock. The clock didn't chime. It gasped, a sound of 1,000 lungs catching their breath at once. "Is it time for the unveiling?" Thomas's voice asked, the thought rippling through the cabinet structure with a mix of terror and a sickening, sycophantic pride. "Is the master's house finally full?" The customer didn't answer Thomas. He wasn't interested in the tool's opinions. He reached out and adjusted the clock's hands, his movements precise and terrifyingly slow. One more piece, the customer decided, his eye turning toward the rift that led back to the workshop. The centerpiece. The table of tongues. He began to walk toward the rift, his massive form flickering in and out of the stars. As he left, the Hall of Silence returned to its oppressive, static state. But the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the tiny, microscopic sounds of the furniture existing. The ticking of the bone clock. The soft weeping of the poet's dreams in the chairs. And the low, constant hum of the silver wires in the cabinet. Miller lay in the dark, a perfect latch. He was empty, yet he was full of the customer's heavy, cold treasures. He was a masterwork of Dunsmere, a monument to a village that no longer existed except as a structural support for a cosmic inventory. But the sanding hadn't been perfect. Deep, deep within the grain, beneath the lacquer, beneath the resin, in the very molecular structure of the wood that had once been a tree that watched the sun rise over the valley, there was a flaw. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't hope. It was a knot. A knot is a place where a branch once grew. It is a site of redirected energy, a hardened, circular defiance of the straight grain. The customer had sanded the surface, but he hadn't removed the knot. He couldn't. To remove the knot would be to destroy the wood itself. And the knot was beginning to dry. As the cold of the collective pulse seeped into Miller, the wood around the knot began to shrink at a different rate than the knot itself. A new sound began to echo in the Hall of Silence. It was tiny. It was almost imperceptible. Cree. Yak. It was the sound of internal tension. It was the sound of the cabinet fighting itself. "Hush," Edwin's head whispered from the walnut keystone. "Hush, Miller. The fit is perfect. Don't ruin the fit." "I can't help it, Father." Miller's thought was a jagged thing, a splinter of consciousness caught in the shrinking wood. "The cold, it's making me brittle is good," Thomas hissed through the wires. "Brittle is hard. Hardness is the final state." But the tension was growing. The knot in Miller's chest was pressing against the black resin, creating a microscopic fissure. And through that fissure, something began to leak. It wasn't blood. It wasn't sap. It was the smell of wood smoke. A thin, gray curl of it drifted out of the latch's keyhole, rising into the sterile, airless Hall of Silence. It was a smell that didn't belong there. It was a smell of change, of consumption, of the one thing the customer's geometric world couldn't account for. Fire. Far down the hall, the customer stopped. He didn't turn around, but the geometric planes of his body began to shift, rearranging themselves into a pattern of profound crystalline agitation. He began to turn. At the same time, the bone clock's heart pendulum missed a beat. The Hall of Silence was no longer silent. It was beginning to thrum. The rift to the workshop flared with a sudden violent light. Thomas's voice, usually a dry rattle, suddenly rose into a frantic, splintering shriek. "Thomas? Thomas, what is happening?" Miller's thought reached out, but the silver wires were vibrating so hard they were beginning to hum a note of pure, sonic destruction. "The workshop!" Thomas screamed, his voice dissolving into the sound of wood being shattered by a giant's hand. "The master..." He is bringing the centerpiece. But it's not finished. The wood, it's still bleeding. The sound of the customer's footsteps returned, but they were no longer slow. They were a rapid, thunderous cadence. The inventory is compromised, the customer vibrated, his voice a roar of grinding stone. The flaw must be excised. He wasn't coming back with a chisel this time. He was coming back with a saw.
You've survived tonight's tale with Mr. Rippers. Come back to Rippers' Nighttime Tales, where fear is just the beginning.